I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. It's another request review, and Nos Paters, Stuart Devers, Pixie68 and Tom A. Turner all asked for an Amicus movie. Victoria Chambers asked for Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, and it's not that, although I'm sure more Amicus movies will be coming down the pipeline soon. I thought I'd use this as an opportunity to check out a movie I'd not seen before, and one that had been sat up there on my shelf unwatched. So, this time round we're going to be talking about the Amicus film, The Skull. The Skull is a 1965 film from Amicus. It's directed by Freddie Francis. It stars Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee alongside Patrick Weinmark. The script was written by Milton Subotsky of Amicus, adapted from a short story by Robert Bloch. It has an impeccable horror pedigree, so how come it took me so long to hear about it? Maybe it's because it's not one of Amicus's portmanteau or anthology films for which they are best known. Certainly the plot for The Skull is very slight, and perhaps, who knows, it might have worked better as a shorter instalment in one of their anthology flicks. And yet there is something quite mesmerising about the full-length feature that we were given. In my mind, the mental shorthand between Hammer and Amicus is that Hammer made Gothic period pieces and Amicus films were generally set in a grimy, slightly threadbare modern Britain. I know that's not watertight, but as a general rule of thumb it holds. It was quite nice then to pop The Skull in and see, at least for the prologue of the movie, Amicus playing in Hammer's sandpit. The prologue is set during the 1800s and takes place midway through a grave robbery. We get the ubiquitous dark and stormy night, the squeaky iron gate opening onto a soundstage-bound eerie cemetery. We've got grave robbers in period dress on a dark and foggy night. And then weirdly the film sets about providing its own spoilers. We know the film's called The Skull, so when the coffin is opened and one of our grave robbers picks up a spade and jumps down into the grave, we're pretty sure about what's going to happen next. Then, a few seconds later, the credits tell us that the script was based on Robert Bloch's short story, The Skull of the Marquis de Sade. So we're way ahead of the film's reveal about the provenance of the object that the movie's concerned about. The prologue sequence also shows us a little of what happens to the first owner of the skull. Well, the second owner of the skull, if you want to be pedantic. So instead of the rest of the film playing out as an is he or isn't he mad film, we already know from 200 years before that the skull has a supernatural influence and ability. The main plot is set in a modern day London and follows Christopher Maitland, played by Peter Cushing. He's a writer on the occult and a collector of occult artifacts. Weinmark plays Marco, the man who provides him with these items as long as no questions are asked. Christopher Lee is a fellow collector, Sir Philip Matthews, who is a font of all exposition. Through Marco, Maitland comes into possession of a book about the life of the Marquis de Sade, bound in human skin, and then later on the titular skull itself. And over the course of the rest of the film, we see the skull exert its malignant influence over Maitland, and that's about it. Robert Bloch's original short story was about 6 pages long. Now, last week we looked at From Beyond, a film also based on a 6-page short story, that time by H.P. Lovecraft. Where Dennis Powley used that as an excuse to go hog wild, Subotsky's script for The Skull apparently only ran to 53 pages. As a general rule of thumb, a page is about a minute of screen time, so Freddie Francis had to get very creative to stretch that slim script into a feature-length product. And I think this is the crux of why The Skull is simultaneously frustrating and fascinating. A bit of a letdown and a hidden gem. You see, there are large stretches of film that are completely dialogue-free or extremely light on dialogue. Francis used the sumptuous set decoration by Scott Sliman for all it was worth, shooting the hell out of Maitland's study. The study is filled with occult knickknacks and made me think of the Warrens' collection of cursed items from the Conjuring movies. I mean, you could absolutely see Maitland at some point getting his hands on the Lament configuration box from Hellraiser. There's one section of film where Cushing is simply sitting of an evening in his study reading his tome on the Marquis de Sade, and Francis's camera glides through the Barber-esque greenly lit study, and we spend minutes simply watching Cushing reading. It sounds boring on paper, but it's these forays into an almost avant-garde film that save the film. This is pure acting. Cushing spends a great deal of the film watching, listening, reacting, thinking. If you have any love for this man as a performer, you owe it to yourself to watch The Skull and just revel in his work. Later on, there's a largely dialogue-free hallucination or nightmare sequence that takes a decided turn into the Kafkaesque and wouldn't have looked out of place in an episode of The Prisoner, which would hit TV screens a couple of years later. Trust me when I say I mean this as a form of the highest praise. In my opinion, The Prisoner is the greatest television show ever made. The final 25 minutes or so of the film is a dialogue-free meditation as we just watch Cushing struggling against the influence of the skull, with it overwhelming him fighting back. It's kind of a masterclass in acting, all born out of the pure necessity of not having enough material in the script. The score, composed by avant-garde composer Elizabeth Lutyens, is the third pillar that props up The Skull. The first pillar being Freddie Francis, the second Peter Cushing. And the film rests upon these three. The score is generally very effective, rising and falling, kind of minimalist, denoting the fear and hysteria that's waxing and waning inside our protagonist. I'll be honest though, I could have done without the slightly too on the nose church organ music every time we see a cross or a crucifix. The opportunity to see Lee and Cushing trading dialogue in scenes where they're not at one another's throats is a joy to behold. It's one of the unalloyed pleasures of Horror Express, and in The Skull, their characters are on even friendlier terms. Lee and Cushing get about 4 scenes together, even though Lee is billed as a guest star. There's an undeniable pleasure in watching these men relish the chance to act with one another. That said, Subotsky's script is flimsy. If I were to try and bulk up the script a bit, this is the question I asked myself. Why would the Marquis de Sade's Skull straight away try and drive Maitland to murder? Why not detour, given the de Sade influence, through sadism? That might have given Maitland a more nuanced journey, something a little bit more meaty, perhaps even Hellraiser-ish to explore, to watch him become crueler and to wonder whether that drive was purely external or whether there was something within him that was just being brought out. The character of Maitland is of a similar cloth to the bookish academic characters you'll find in M.R. James's ghost stories, whose worlds are turned upside down when they collide with the supernatural. Except Maitland is not a confirmed bachelor as the protagonists in James's stories are. He has a wife, and one of my other criticisms was I would like to have seen her character developed into something other than a character who is just necessary for the final act to be played out, more of a requirement than a character. As it is, we have a product that was probably hampered from the start by a very weak and, I believe, written maybe in 5 days script from Subotsky, where everyone concerned really raised above and beyond the call of duty to create something more out of the very minimal foundation that they were given to work with. Assured superb directing by Freddie Francis. Some of the more surreal shots, like those coming from inside the skull where you can see our actors through the sockets, are fantastic. The descent into surrealism, paranoia, madness, all with Peter Cushing central to this, and largely without dialogue, watching him just go through this internal struggle in a film that, whilst it isn't out and out scary, offers enough chills and thrills that if you love your horror history and you're at all interested in the work of these titans, then The Skull really is something for you to check out. Slightly more than a curio, slightly more than something Maitland would have on one of his dusty old shelves, but perhaps not the peak of greatness that any of the people involved had hit at previous points in their career.